Look at these two places. Both are cities. Both have houses, roads, people going to work, kids walking to school, or not walking, as we'll get to. But they feel completely different. Not just visually, functionally. The way movement works, the way neighborhoods form, the way strangers interact, all of it flows from one thing, the shape of the streets. There are basically two philosophies of urban street design. One is the grid. The other is what urban planners call the dendritic pattern, from the Greek word for tree, because it looks like branches. And the choice between them, made by planners and developers often without much public debate, shapes almost everything about how a city actually works. So let's talk about both. The grid is one of the oldest ideas in city planning. Ancient Rome used it. So did the Tang Dynasty capital of Shangan, now Xi'an, laid out in the 7th century with a near-perfect rectangular grid. Spanish colonial cities in the Americas were built on grids by royal decree. And when the United States was being settled, the Land Ordinance of 1785 divided most of the continent into a vast grid of townships and sections, a geometry you can still see from the air over the Midwest today. The logic of a grid is simple. Every block is connected to every adjacent block. You can go north, south, east, or west at almost any intersection. If one route is blocked by traffic, by a detour, by a downed tree, there are always alternatives. Mathematically, a grid maximizes the number of possible routes between any 2 points. This redundancy is the grid's superpower. It makes cities resilient. It spreads traffic across many streets instead of funneling it onto a few. And it makes walking, cycling, and transit all dramatically more practical. Because you can always take a shortcut. You can always find a parallel route. And destinations are rarely more than a couple of blocks from a through street. The grid also shapes how neighborhoods feel. When streets connect, strangers interact. Shops appear on corners. The city becomes legible. You learn it quickly because the logic is consistent. You know that if you keep going north, you'll eventually hit 5th Avenue, or the waterfront, or the train station. Now look at this. Streets that loop back on themselves. Cul-de-sacs. Dead ends that are technically considered a feature, not a flaw. A few major arterial roads carrying nearly all the traffic, feeding into collector roads, which feed into local residential streets that go nowhere except back to themselves. This is the dendritic pattern, and it's not some accidental consequence of lazy planning. It was deliberately designed starting in the mid-20th century with a specific set of goals in mind. The origins go back to Clarence Stein's design for Radburn, New Jersey in 1929, often called the first town designed explicitly around the car. The idea was to separate pedestrians from cars entirely. Residents would walk through interior greenways sheltered from traffic. Cars would be limited to their own loop roads. In theory, it was actually a humanist vision, a reaction against the danger of cars in traditional city streets. But when the dendritic pattern was mass-produced for post-war suburbs, stripped of Radburn's greenways and pedestrian infrastructure, what remained was just the disconnection. Streets that don't connect. Neighborhoods sealed off from each other. And every trip, no matter how short, funneled onto a major arterial road. Here's where the two systems diverge most dramatically. What happens when a lot of people need to move at once? In a grid, traffic distributes. There are many paths between any 2 points, and drivers naturally spread across them. One street gets heavy, you turn onto the parallel street. This is why grid cities, for all their density, often have more manageable traffic than you'd expect. In a dendritic system, traffic has nowhere to go except onto the arterials. Every resident in every cul-de-sac on every lollipop loop has to exit through the same collector road, which empties onto the same arterial. The math is brutal. You can have relatively low density housing and still create crushing congestion at the arterial intersections because every single trip must pass through them. This is called traffic concentration, and it explains something counterintuitive. Suburban areas with far fewer people per square mile than urban areas often have comparably bad or worse traffic, not because there are more people, but because there are fewer routes. And there's another consequence: emergency response. In a grid, a fire truck or ambulance can almost always find a route to any address. In a tightly sealed cul-de-sac development, if the one entry road is blocked by a car accident, by flooding, by a fallen tree, there may be no way in at all. The street pattern has a near total control over whether walking is possible. Not just comfortable, Possible. In a grid, walking works because shortcuts exist. The distance between where you are and where you're going is close to the straight line distance. A destination 2 blocks away is roughly 2 blocks to walk. Shops appear on corners and along through streets because foot traffic exists there. In a dendritic network, the geometry punishes walking. 2 houses that are 600 feet apart as the crow flies might be a mile apart by road because the streets curve, loop back, and don't connect. The last mile problem in transit planning, the gap between the bus stop or train station and your actual destination, becomes the last several miles. And if there's no sidewalk on the arterial road, which in many American suburbs there isn't, walking isn't uncomfortable, it's dangerous. This isn't a minor quality of life issue. Research consistently links walkable neighborhoods with lower obesity rates, lower rates of cardiovascular disease, lower car ownership costs per household, and higher social connection between neighbors. The street pattern isn't just infrastructure, it's a health and social policy. To be fair, the cul-de-sac and the dendritic pattern have real defenders, and they're not all wrong. Dead-end streets have very low through traffic by definition. That makes them genuinely quiet. Kids can play in the street, something that's essentially impossible on a through street carrying cars from elsewhere. Residents often report stronger neighbor relationships precisely because the space is semi-private and shared. There's a reason cul-de-sacs remain popular with buyers who have young children. There's also a security argument. A neighborhood with one entrance and no through streets is harder to drive into randomly. Some research suggests lower rates of certain types of property crime in dendritic developments. The honest answer is that these benefits are real, but they're localized. The residents of the cul-de-sac benefit from the quiet. The region as a whole pays for it with traffic, poor transit, car dependency, and all the costs that come with it. Ultimately, the residents of the cul-de-sac suffer from the same consequences as well. But does it have to be one or the other? Most planners today reject the binary choice. The real question isn't grid or dendritic, it's about connectivity. How many routes exist between any 2 points? How far does the street network deviate from the straight line distance? Planners use a metric called intersection density, the number of intersections per square mile, as a proxy for connectivity. Grid cities like Portland and San Francisco score extremely high. Sprawling suburban developments score extremely low. And outcomes, walkability, transit ridership, traffic distribution, track closely with that number. Some cities have adopted what's called the fused grid, a design that gives residential clusters the quiet and low traffic of dendritic streets while connecting them to a permeable grid for cyclists and pedestrians. You can still walk through even if cars can't drive through. This preserves the livability of local streets without sacrificing the connectivity the broader network needs. The Netherlands has been doing versions of this for decades with their Woonerf, or living street concept. Shared spaces where pedestrians and cyclists have structural priority, but cars aren't banned outright. The key insight is that street design is not just about vehicles, it's about all the ways humans move and interact in space. But there is a valuable insight that needs to be mentioned for this living street concept to work. The street design is narrow. The buildings address the street. The narrow streets naturally slow car traffic, and the buildings activate the street to keep them safe, avoiding dark alleyways where safety becomes a concern. New developments in many cities are now required to meet minimum connectivity standards. Some older suburbs are retrofitting pedestrian connections between formerly sealed neighborhoods. It's slow work. You can't rebuild a street network overnight, but the direction is clear. Next time you look at a city from above, or just navigate through one, pay attention to the street pattern. Notice whether streets connect or dead end. Notice how long it takes to get between 2 nearby things. Notice whether there's a sidewalk, whether the walk feels safe, whether you'd feel comfortable traveling without depending on a car. These aren't small details. They're the bones of the city. Every other decision, where shops go, where transit runs, who drives and who walks, how long your commute is, rests within it. The street network is the first decision, and in many ways the most consequential one a city ever makes. If this raised more questions than it answered, good. There's a lot more to dig into, and I hope you'll keep digging with me.